Okay, so for oh wait, I'm just gonna wait till it's okay. So for anyone watching, this is Professor David Moscovitch. He's a clinical psychologist, and he's agreed to speak with us today so that we can learn a bit more about clinical psychology at the University of Waterloo. Again, I'm Grace, and this is Jerica, and we're the VP of Academics at PsychSoc. So just to start with, what was your education and career path that led you to your current position?
I did a bachelor's of science at the University of Toronto, and I didn't know that psychology was something that I was actually interested in. I was a student who went into undergrad thinking that I was interested in law in high school, and thought I would major in criminology at U of T, and did all the prerequisites that first year, and then got totally disillusioned with that path and had that crisis of, I don't know what I'm going to do with my life, which I'm sure people can relate to. I think that's normal. It's definitely normal to have that. And through some searching and trying out, I ended up discovering psychology and loving it. But I did a year abroad in my undergrad and really didn't get to focus on psychology until I was in my fourth year. So I had to take a fifth and an extra year. And a lot of the courses I had taken earlier really didn't count towards my major. I'd even taken science breadth requirements because I figured I'd be an arts major. So I really had a circuitous kind of undergraduate path. But once I landed on psychology, I knew it felt right. I was really passionate about it. I found my courses really interesting and engaging, and I did really well in psychology. It was by far my highest grades that I was getting. So I decided after I graduated my fifth year, I took a year off to kind of collect my thoughts and apply to graduate school. And at that time, you had to take your GREs, and applications are really hard to juggle with everything else. And I wanted to also continue working on research with my undergraduate thesis advisor. We were trying to publish the findings of my thesis. And so I thought it was wise to take a year just to make sure and give myself some space and live a little bit as well. I got a job in a restaurant as a waiter and got to travel a little bit that year with the money that I made. So then I applied to graduate school. I applied to, I think, 10 or 12 programs and got interviews at 4 of them, and was really lucky to get into Boston University, which was my first choice, and an American school, and the place where my girlfriend at the time really wanted to do her graduate training in Boston, in the field of education. And so ended up moving to Boston for 5 years and got my master's and PhD at Boston University. And this was now 2005. And there was a kind of a crossroads, a choice point where you have to do a final year internship in a PhD program in clinical psychology, which works like medical school, where you apply to a bunch of places and then you get matched somewhere. And as a Canadian who had been an international student in the States, I was applying both to the United States and to Canada with the thought that coming back to Canada would be nice to have an opportunity to kind of settle. At this point, my girlfriend had become my wife. We were thinking about a future together and having kids and wanting to raise them in Canada. And so I ended up matching at St. Joe's in Hamilton, at St. Joseph's Healthcare in Hamilton, which has a great internship program, and moved back here for my internship. Graduated at the end of that internship year, and then started my position at the University of Waterloo the following year. Lucky for me, they had a faculty opening that happened to coincide with my year of graduating. So it feels like a very fortunate path that I found my way to the University of Waterloo, and I started my position in 2006, and I still am here and very happy to be here.
Awesome. Thank you for telling us that. As our next question, how is research a part of being a professor?
Yeah, research is a big part of being a professor. I mean, if you do a PhD in any field, your whole existence during your PhD is revolves around doing your research. The whole goal of a PhD program of any sort is to become an expert through research in a very specialized area. Now, clinical psych is unique in that there's also another part of the program, which is that you have to become a trained clinician while also becoming a researcher. And so I think a lot of people think about professors as being teachers primarily, but in fact, I think that they're primarily at their core experts through their research in a particular area, which gives them the credibility to teach about that area. So I think all of us who are PhD level faculty at our cores have a passion for discovery and answering scientific or not scientific, depending on your field, questions. And we use our research piece of our job, which is substantial to do that. So most of us are, you know, a portion of our job is carved out officially for teaching, and a portion is officially carved out for research. And that's what, you know, the university is a place that houses all of these research laboratories that professors are working in, and then they're also mentoring and teaching students to participate in that work.
And then, so on the topic of research, what is your lab or are you currently studying and researching?
Yeah, so my research is in the area of anxiety, adult anxiety, with a focus on social anxiety in particular. And we try to answer questions about the cognitive, behavioral, and interpersonal aspects of social anxiety, and to try to understand what factors make someone vulnerable to or lead to the persistence of social anxiety, and then how to target those factors effectively in treatment. And so there's always a number of different streams of work that we're working on in the lab. Some of those streams are led by my graduate students who are getting their PhDs and kind of focusing in on a very specialized area, and some of them are led by me and maybe undergraduate thesis students or other lab members, research assistants, RAs. Sometimes we have a postdoc in the lab. So right now, a lot of our work is looking at, well, there's so many themes actually right now, but they all sort of interweave. One of the interesting things that we're looking at is the effects of COVID-19 on social anxiety, not the effects of the virus, but the effects of the pandemic context and things like mask wearing, which is very interesting. How does mask wearing impact our ability to detect other people's emotions, for example? And how would that be impacted by struggle with social anxiety, where we know that social anxiety makes people more vulnerable to having difficulty decoding certain types of emotions, especially neutral faces, for example. And a mask tends to conceal so much of the important features of a face. So we're doing a study on that. A longstanding area of research has been on mental imagery and memory in social anxiety, where people who struggle with social anxiety tend to have these really negative images of themselves, where they actually see themselves within their mind's eye, within their imagination, as appearing in a negatively distorted way, where they think that they appear really unattractive or anxious or socially inept. And that image they believe is accurate, but in fact it's not. It's a very negatively distorted image of themselves, but they don't know that. So they're walking around the world using this image as a lens or a guide for their behavior and their interactions. And we're interested in studying those images, and we've been doing that for about 10 years now, and looking at, turns out they're very relevant to also early memories. So people tend to have these socially painful experiences where they're humiliated, and the image sort of captures that experience, that feeling that they had during that memory. And so we're interested in understanding how memory and what we understand about memory plays a role. So, and one final area that we're sort of looking at a lot now is the area of, and it's also relevant to COVID-19, which is the area of social support and social anxiety. Social anxiety people with social anxiety tend to avoid other people. That's their primary strategy for dealing with their anxiety, which is not a surprise, but it also makes it difficult for them to receive the kind of social support they might need. And so we're really interested in understanding social anxiety in lots of social support contexts. One student of mine is looking at social anxiety in friendships, in close friendships, which we don't know a lot about. Another is looking at how socially anxious people respond to acts of compassion from others. Another is interested in reassurance seeking in social anxiety. And so different facets of social support, and ultimately we try to understand how does social anxiety get in the way? In what are the mechanisms that prevent people who struggle with social anxiety from getting the social support they need? And can we target those in treatment, in psychological treatment, to try to open people up more effectively to get the support they need? We've learned in COVID-19, we've known it before, but it's really highlighted for us how critical it is for people to be getting enough or optimal social support, and how that protects people from all sorts of negative consequences.
That is all really, really interesting. Thank you for telling us about that. Is there something that you want to research more or conduct a study on in the near future that you aren't currently looking at?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's always one of the things that I've discovered about research that I didn't even know myself going into graduate school was that, like, when I went to graduate school, I didn't have questions about social anxiety. I didn't know very much about social anxiety, other than what I may have experienced in my own life. We've all felt socially anxious in different situations, for sure, when we give presentations or have a date, or have to participate in an interview or meet new people, or whatever it might be. But I didn't have a series of questions that I was asking. But it's through research that every study I find brings up even more questions than answers that I want to then pursue. So one of the things I mentioned is we've been looking at imagery and memory, and this really nice sort of link that I've been able to achieve there is that my father is a professor emeritus of neuropsychology at the University of Toronto. And in fact, one of the reasons I didn't want to go into psychology to begin with was to kind of stay away from from that, just to sort of carve my own path. But he's not a clinical psychologist. And we're collaborating on trying to understand how memory updating can be achieved through therapy for people with social anxiety by combining our knowledge, his knowledge of memory and the brain on one hand, and my knowledge of clinical processes and social anxiety on the other. So I think one area that I really want to move towards is continuing to combine those things in a way that allows us to translate the clinical processes that I'm familiar with into brain mechanisms, and vice versa, translate the brain mechanisms into understanding how to even more effectively target the clinical processes.
All right. And then a more general question for someone who's maybe unsure about what area of psych they're interested in, but they're a psych major. What would you say is the best course or the best way to get an idea of, or to get prepared if they want to go into graduate school, but they're not exactly sure which area in psych?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably an obvious answer, but the best way is to try to get experience working in a few different labs while you're in while you're in an undergrad, or even in the year or two after undergrad. After you graduate, you can continue working as an RA somewhere. I think a lot of students do that. It's not a bad idea. A lot of students spend those couple of years thinking, if I'm going to devote 5, 6, or 7 years to graduate school, PhD in clinical psych can take 6 or 7 years in an experimental program, often 5 or 6 years. I want to have a pretty good idea that I enjoy the research process, that I'm passionate about the topic, because that's what you're going to be doing most of the time. So a lot of students figure that out by taking the initiative to reach out to different professors who run different labs in our department, and to see if they can get involved, either as a volunteer or a paid RA, or through like a directed studies or apprenticeship course that we offer, the 264, 464 classes. There's a few like that offer students opportunities to work more closely with a faculty member on research. So I know students who kind of try out cognitive neuroscience labs and clinical labs and social and developmental labs to try to get a footing on where their interests lie. Ultimately, I think if you think grad school may be an option, doing a thesis, an undergraduate honors thesis, is the culminating experience of an honors bachelor's degree in psychology, and will really give you an opportunity to explore the research process from the start to the end, the entire scope and sequence. And it's graduate schools really kind of expect their, at least in clinical psychology, we expect our applicants to have completed an honors thesis or something akin to an honors thesis when they're applying for graduate school. And we expect people to be able to talk about that experience in the interview process.
Awesome. On that same note, though, if someone didn't really gain any research experience in their undergrad, is there any other way that they can make up for that lack of experience?
I would say take a couple years off. Like, if that person really thinks they want to apply for a PhD in psychology, I don't think they should do that until they gain research experience. So if their career path is not to go on to do a PhD, that's okay. There's lots of other possible paths for them. But if they really want to apply for a PhD in graduate school, I think they need to find a way to get that experience beforehand. It's really expected of them. So I have at least one graduate student in my lab now who went through undergrad at Waterloo in a very science-heavy area and didn't in an area of biology, I believe it was, and really didn't find psychology until she was far enough along that it wasn't going to become a major. But then really decided, I love psychology and I really want to do this. I want to get a PhD, and she recognized there were a bunch of courses and experience that she didn't have. So she actually went back and our department offers students an opportunity to take can't remember what the program is called, but you can go back and make up, maybe it's called a makeup program.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it is.
Yeah, and so she was able to then get her honors thesis through that program and work in a number of different labs, and actually took a couple of years off to continue doing that after undergrad, and was willing to kind of put her life on hold, which I think is an anxiety that some people have about that. And now is well on her way to getting a PhD. She's, I think, in her 5th year of the PhD program. So yeah, if you're going into a field that's not a PhD in clinical psychology, by all means, it's okay that you haven't had research experience in your undergrad if you know you want to do something else. It's just if you want to do a PhD, you should have that experience before you apply.
And for students who are psych majors but don't necessarily want to go to graduate school, what are some other jobs that are, like, I feel like a lot of psych students that we've spoken to, they think it's grad school or something else, but they don't know the other thing. So what are some other jobs people can go into?
Yeah, I really think it depends what you mean by jobs. Like, do you mean, are there careers that people can have with a bachelor's degree in psychology?
Yeah.
Or do you mean, is there like a summer job you can get with a bachelor's degree in psychology?
Like after graduation, like what are kinds of professions people can go into without graduate school necessarily?
In the field of psychology, I don't know. I don't know that there are a lot of jobs out there that are specialized. So you can certainly get a job as a research assistant with a bachelor's degree in psychology if you want to do that even for a while. Some people find that to be really interesting, and if you work in a lab where it's a social lab and there's lots of people around, and you're involved in the research process, you can certainly do that. And if you're good at what you do, you're a valuable commodity. Research labs are always looking for a great RA or a lab manager type of person who's got their hand in everything. And that's, I think, like a research coordinator or a lab manager is the type of thing that a person with a bachelor's degree tends to do. People who want to do a more specialized thing in psychology, like direct some research or get involved in counseling or clinical work, usually you need at least a master's degree in order to do that, I think. I could be wrong. there could be other industries out there. I think Grace may have frozen. Yeah, there she is. She's coming back. You're back. I think there are industries out there that may value a bachelor's degree in psychology more than I'm aware of. So I'm thinking about industries like consulting or business types of industries where we know that the field of business and consulting has recognized that psych graduates are valuable for helping to advise how people think, consumers, how do consumers think? How can we kind of manipulate consumers to buy our products? Whether they are looking for someone with a bachelor's degree or a graduate degree is something I'm not aware of. I think it depends on the industry.
Thank you. Now for our next question, can you tell us what the difference is between a clinical psychologist and a psychiatrist?
Yeah, a psychiatrist goes to medical school. A psychiatrist is a medical doctor who gets their MD through medical school, and they specialize in medical school in the subfield of psychiatry. And when psychiatrists practice in the field, they typically, at least in Ontario, tend to primarily prescribe medications. That's their ability. Psychologists are not allowed to prescribe medications. We psychologists in Ontario get a PhD. They go through graduate school to get a PhD, not medical school. So we're not experts in anatomy or how the medications may affect the brain chemistry of our patients. Or we tend not to be experts. There are some psychologists who happen to study neurochemistry of behavior, but we don't have prescription privileges. So the main difference, I would say, the most important difference is psychiatrists prescribe medication and they're medical doctors. Psychologists are scientist practitioners who have a PhD and usually focus and specialize, at least in clinical psychology, on psychological treatments, not on medical treatments.
Okay. And then one very specific question from one of our students. So do you know any resources for or contacts of international graduate students in clinical?
Oops. I think Grace froze
continue. I think Grace
mid-question.
sometimes freezes.
Yeah.
To continue the question, so do you know any resources for or contacts of international graduate students in clinical psychology? As an international graduate student, the student is a little bit unsure about their chances of getting into a PhD program of clinical psychology because of the lack of funding, and it makes them a little bit hesitant to try.
Yeah, that's a really tough question because it converges with the rules of that different countries and institutions have, and those rules are always changing depending on the government that's in, like. So especially, I think even for Canadians going to study in the United States, which used to be so easy, now, when under the Trump administration, it became a lot harder to do that kind of thing. So I would advise them to do their research, be persistent, find out institution by institution. First, think about where they'd be willing to live in the world. So, someone who is an international student who may not be able to get into a Canadian graduate program because we may limit enrollment in our universities here, let's say, maybe they would have good luck in England or Australia getting into a PhD program in clinical psychology if they want to do something in English. Those countries have very, very good programs that have excellent reputations and very good researchers working there. So they come to mind immediately because in my area of anxiety, those are two leading countries where some of the best research in the world is happening, in Australia and in England, in the area of, let's say, anxiety and CBT. But yeah, I think it's tough. I think it's really, I know when I was an international student studying in the United States, even though I was welcome there, while I was in graduate school, 9/11 happened. And that really changed everyone's perception of foreigners, people who are not, American. And I remember feeling anxious about, are they going to revoke my visa? It may have seemed ridiculous to have those feelings, but I think as an international student, you're always feeling like, you're the first person that people may say doesn't belong here, and you may run into visa problems. So I think I felt that feeling of anxiety while I was an international student, so I understand the feeling. But that said, on the other hand, the opportunities available to students in other countries that may not be available in their home countries should hopefully make them determined to keep pursuing that dream, because there's so much talent out there internationally, and I personally think it's in the best interest of our field to welcome people from other countries and international students to study in our institutions, and to allow for that kind of free transfer of knowledge. So hopefully a student like that will find a footing somewhere. But be persistent, do your research, reach out, don't be discouraged, and see what you can learn.
Okay. And then what is a misperception about clinical psychology?
What's a
misperception?
A misperception.
Yeah.
I bet you guys would know better than I would, but one thing that comes to mind is occasionally people believe that clinical psychologists can read people's minds. I've had people say to me at parties or wherever, when they find out what I do, oh, I hope you're not reading my mind, which is awkward. Clinical psychologists cannot read people's minds. We don't know how to do that. So that's one misperception. I think another misperception is that we prescribe medication. I think that's probably a bigger one that people have, that I think many people don't know the difference between a psychiatrist and a clinical psychologist. Perhaps a third one is that we don't do research, or that that our clinical work is sort of based on old Freudian ideas rather than evidence-based scientist practitioner kind of model. Those are three things that come to mind. I'm sure there's others.
Thanks. Sharika, do you want to ask the last?
Sure, yeah. As our final question for today, do you think that mental health issues are more biologically or socially rooted? Or maybe both?
Yeah, I mean, it's always both. It's a false question. And I talk about this a lot in the undergraduate course on psychopathology that I teach, 257. People ask, is mental illness nature or nurture? Is it caused by nature or nurture? And the answer is that it's a silly question. It's always both. We know that there's always a reciprocal relationship between, your biology is shaped by your learning, and vice versa. And so the best way to think about mental health is through an integrative model that brings into consideration lots of different causal factors, including biological and social ones.
Thank you. Those are all our questions. We're going to be posting this on the YouTube channel, the PsychSoc YouTube channel. So thank you again, Professor Moscovitch.
It was my pleasure. It was nice to talk to both of you, and just to say people can feel